Well, perhaps it's only fitting he's our very first guest here on the brand new Steve Deace Show, powered by Conservative Review here on the Salem Radio Network. He is Texas Senator Ted Cruz, 2016 presidential candidate. And Ted, it's good to have you on the show. Welcome aboard.
Steve, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you, and congratulations on the launch of the new show. I'm deeply honored to join you for the very first show of the new show.
Well, we appreciate that, and you've been spending a lot more time in Iowa recently, and here where we're broadcasting across the country from, and there are some polls out today that are showing those efforts are paying off. Now, you are well aware of my skepticism of these polls, but obviously you'll take good news when you get it. So are you seeing evidence on the ground of this, our favorite word in the media, surge, or is it just that we're behind what you guys were already seeing?
Well, I mean, it was certainly encouraging that two polls came out of Iowa today that showed a big surge for us. One with me moving forward to 15% in the polls, another one with me moving forward to 14% in the polls, and that's encouraging, and it's indicative of what we're seeing on the ground. You know, I was in Iowa this past weekend in Des Moines speaking at a large Republican Party gathering, about 2,000 activists. Most of the other candidates were there. Most of the other candidates addressed the activists, and the consensus, the front page of the Des Moines Register this weekend said that of all of the candidates, that we got by far the strongest reaction, the loudest applause, and had the most support. And that's really what we're seeing on the ground, is we are seeing a grassroots army come together and conservatives uniting. And I think if conservatives continue to unite, I think that is the key to victory in Iowa and in the primary generally. And I think it's also the key to winning the general election and turning the country around.
Let's talk principles. Let's talk issues. The eve of the debate, literally like an hour before the debate, your campaign came out with your tax plan, your tax reform plan to eliminate the IRS, a flat tax that makes things fair and simpler. Give us the details.
Well, that's exactly right. We rolled out what we call the simple flat tax. And for a typical family of four, the first $36,000 of income you earn, you pay no tax whatsoever. No income tax, no payroll tax, absolutely nothing. Above $36,000, you pay a flat tax of 10%, and it's the same rate for everyone. It's uniform across the board, which means finally the hedge fund billionaire doesn't pay a lower rate than his secretary. Everyone pays the same uniform fair rate. In addition to that, there is a simple flat tax for business of 16% on business revenue. And those two together allow us to eliminate the payroll tax altogether, to eliminate the corporate income tax altogether, to eliminate the alternative minimum tax altogether, to eliminate the Obamacare taxes altogether. And you have a simple flat tax which allows us to abolish the IRS. The consequence of all of this, the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation ran the numbers and scored the plan, and this simple flat tax of 10% across the board would result in 4.9 million new jobs over 10 years. It would result in an additional 44% of capital investment. And amazingly, every income class up and down would see, from the very poorest to the very richest, a minimum of a 14% increase in after-tax income, which to put real numbers on that, if you're a single mom, if you're making $40,000 a year, the impact of a 14% increase in your after-tax income is an additional $5,600 a year in your pocket to provide for your kids. That's transformational. I think it's getting back to the Reagan growth, the Reagan Kemp vision of economic growth driving American prosperity.
You mentioned the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation took a look at this, because that was going to be my next question. Do the numbers add up? I mean, you're talking about radical change, but does that radical change add up?
The numbers add up. I would encourage folks, if you go to our website, it's tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. You can see the specifics of the tax plan. You can see the numbers and how they add up. We laid all of the details out so you can see exactly how this would produce booming economic growth. And critically also, it levels the playing field. So, for example, the 16% business flat tax. Right now today, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world, 35%, and it's very unfair how it's applied. So some giant corporations with armies of accountants pay little to nothing, and yet small businesses, mom and pop businesses, get hammered with much heavier taxes. With the simple flat tax, every business, whether giant or small, pays the same flat, fair, uniform rate of 16%. So it gets Washington out of the business of cronyism and picking winners and losers. And I'll tell you, Steve, a second consequence of this tax plan is the business flat tax is what's called border adjustable, which means if you're a manufacturer or if you're a farmer or rancher in Iowa and you are making goods or growing corn for export, anything that is exported is exempted from the 16% business flat tax. So you don't pay any business tax at all on exports. That gives us a tremendous advantage to our farmers and ranchers and manufacturers to export our goods. And on the flip side, every import that comes into this country has the 16% business flat tax put on it, just like the American-produced goods that are being sold here. What that means is that American farmers and ranchers and manufacturers fight on a level playing field where it's fair. The result of this will have an incredible impact, increasing our exports and increasing our ability to compete competitively on a fair and even playing field.
Texas Senator Ted Cruz, our very first ever guest here on the brand new Steve Deace Show, powered by Conservative Review here on the Salem Radio Network. When we come back, a Supreme Court justice compares himself to the Nazis. We're going to get Ted Cruz's reaction to that here in a moment.
You're listening to Steve Deace.
I like you.
He's not a right-wing zealot. He's a Bible-thumping Jesus freak. If you're going to rip him, get it right. This is Steve Deace.
Texas Senator Ted Cruz is our guest here on the Steve Deace Show. I was at the debate in Boulder last week, and there's a lot of talk that your sort of Howard Beale moment, Ted, you know, where you're kind of mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore about the media, might have been the defining moment anyone's had, sort of that Ronald Reagan, I am paying for this microphone, defining moment anyone's had in these debates thus far. What kind of reaction have you gotten from people around the country to that moment?
Well, Steve, the reaction has been phenomenal. I mean, the momentum we've seen coming out of that last debate has just taken your breath away. The first debate we had, we raised over $1 million in the first 100 hours coming out of the debate. The second debate we had, we raised $1 million not in 100 hours, but in the first 48 hours as people all over the country went to tedcruz.org and contributed. This third debate, we raised $1.1 million, not in 100 hours or not even in 48 hours, but it took us 22 hours to raise $1.1 million. People all over the country went to tedcruz.org. They contributed. I mean, it really was an explosion of support. And I think the reason is that people are fed up and frustrated. They're fed up with the liberal bias of the media. They're fed up with the attacks, and they're fed up with the mendacity of Washington, and they're looking for someone just to stand up and speak the truth and defend common sense conservative principles. And that's something that I have tried to do each and every day and intend to continue doing exactly that.
Ted, I want to go back to your background as an attorney, as a constitutional attorney who's argued numerous cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. I want to get your reaction to this audio. We played it earlier in the show here tonight, and I want to know what you think. This is Justice Anthony Kennedy. Listen to this.
Well, what is the duty of a public official if he or she cannot, in good conscience and consistent with their own personal and religious beliefs, enforce a law that they think is morally corrupt? Do you know how many judges do you think resigned in the Third Reich? 3. Great respect, it seems to me, have to be given to people who resign rather than do something they think is morally wrong in order to make a point. However, the rule of law is that as a public official, in performing your legal duties, you are bound to enforce the law. It's difficult sometimes to see whether or not what you're doing is transgressing your own personal philosophy. This requires considerable introspection. But it would be difficult for me to say that people are free to ignore a decision of the Supreme Court. Lincoln went through this in the Dred Scott case. These are difficult moral questions.
A lot of what he says there, I guess from his point of view, is somewhat reasonable, but to draw a historical parallel, Ted, between him essentially being the man that has ushered in this brave new world of questionable, if not outright immorality and redefining of marriage and the rule of law and religious liberty, to compare himself with Nazi Germany, what does that say?
Look, Steve, that was stunning, and that exchange you just played came from a discussion that Justice Kennedy did at Harvard Law School. I posted the video of that very same statement on our Facebook page because I thought it was so stunning to have a Supreme Court justice compare his own lawless ruling to the draconian oppression of the Nazis is beyond stunning, and it's worth underscoring. This is not you or me comparing the Supreme Court to the Nazis. This is Justice Kennedy comparing the Supreme Court to the Nazis, his own decision that was utterly lawless. And what he is saying to Christians is, you will obey the jackboot of what we decree, or you will pay the price. It is a statement that embodies so much arrogance, so much hubris, so much contempt for our democratic process. And you know, one of the things that's also buried in what Justice Kennedy says, he says to all the other officials, well, you must obey the law. Well, Steve, you know well, courts don't make law. Justice Kennedy's opinion, in which he laid out his view that in his enlightened view, the definition of marriage that has been true for millennia, that state legislatures have adopted across this nation, that marriage is the union of one man and one woman, his opinion that is no longer sufficiently enlightened is not law. People are not obliged to obey justices who are defying the Constitution, defying the law, who are committing acts of judicial tyranny. And I will point out that no less than Justice Scalia, in his dissent, made exactly that point, where he said this decision is a profound threat to our democracy. It is 5 unelected lawyers declaring themselves the rulers of 320 million Americans. And Justice Scalia predicts that state and local officials will refuse to obey this lawless decision because it is so outside the authority of the Supreme Court. And yes, Justice Kennedy is telling us that the court is like the Nazis and we have no choice but buckle under to their oppression. It really is a stunning admission of how corrupt the court has become.
Is there a point, and maybe this is it, I don't know. I mean, our show's powered by Conservative Review. We ran a column earlier today, not written by me, but saying, hey, Justice Kennedy should have to resign for making statements like this. Is there a point where these rulings, statements become so not just unconstitutional, anti-constitutional, that resignation, impeachment is in line for these judges?
Look, of course Justice Kennedy should resign. In the wake of the Supreme Court's lawless decisions on Obamacare and marriage, I publicly called for a constitutional amendment subjecting Supreme Court justices to periodic retention elections, just like you have in the state of Iowa, where you had 3 justices who lawlessly tore down the marriage laws in Iowa. And the people of Iowa rose up and threw those judges out. If Supreme Court justices are going to behave like politicians and try to make law instead of following the Constitution, they should be subject to democratic accountability. And these statements from Justice Kennedy show just the utter contempt he has for the rights of the people to pass the laws to govern ourselves, and that they should rightly prompt outrage.
Texas Senator Ted Cruz, our very first guest on the remastered Steve Deace Show. Ted, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Steve, and congrats again on the new show. You're a fantastic voice for liberty, and I'm proud to call you a friend.
Thank you, man. Same here. That's the man I hope, ladies and gentlemen, is the next president of the United States, and I'm not ashamed to say it.